I've had the Cade Nano tank for around 3 months now, and in that time I've changed the sand, I've changed my lights, I've added fish and corals, I've gone through the ugly stage, and of course I've encountered a few problems. So today I'll talk you through how life has been in the first 3 months of this saltwater nano tank. And I actually encountered my first problem on day one. I set the tank up with Carib Sea life sand, which you're not supposed to rinse before use, so I got one giant dust cloud at first. And when that subsided, I was left with what I think was a bacterial bloom that hung around for a lot longer than I was expecting and made the tank really cloudy. It might just have been dust, but I was running a filter roller from day one, so I don't think that was it. And when it didn't subside after 2 weeks, I decided to add a UV sterilizer to clear it. Now, getting rid of the bacteria that comes with live sand kind of defeats the object, but my plan was always to transfer my existing rock and coral over from my Fluval Evo, so I didn't really need the bacteria, and I only bought the sand because it was nice and fine and looked good. However, the UV sterilizer didn't work, so I completely drained and replaced all of the water, which did work. And after going through all of that, I decided that the sand wasn't right for me after all. Because it's so fine, I got constant mini sand tornadoes, even with the power heads on their minimum setting. And I like to run a decent amount of flow to keep detritus from settling on the sand bed, so this stuff had to go. And I replaced it with a fine gravel / coarse sand that I got from my local Maidenhead Aquatics that I'm much happier with, and it still looks really nice. The next thing I had to do was move all the rock, coral and livestock over from my Fluval Evo. It was a pretty easy process even with only one functioning arm, and the clownfish were easy to catch, as was my pistol shrimp. Because the Cade holds about 250 gallons or 100 litres after displacement, I needed to use a lot of brand new salt water because the Fluval Evo only holds around 40 litres. But I managed to drain about 30 litres from the Fluval Evo that had been running for around a year, which made the transition a little easier on the corals, and I didn't lose any livestock in the move, so it went as smoothly as I could hope. But perhaps inevitably, given this was set up as an insta-tank, I have had a few issues since the move. In the Fluval Evo, my nitrates always sat around the 10 parts per million mark, but when I moved everything over, my nitrates dropped to 0 with my phosphate at 0.1 parts per million, which led to an outbreak of green cyanobacteria. I've been battling it for about a month now, and while I'm over the worst of it, I do still have a way to go. I've turned the power heads up a bit so the stuff can't settle on the sand bed, and I dosed nitrate for about a week or so to get my levels back in balance, and my nitrates now sit at around 10 parts per million, with my phosphate at around 0.1 parts per million, which is probably roughly what I'll be aiming for long term. Now, I sometimes hear things like cyanobacteria and dinoflagellates being referred to as part of the ugly stage, but I don't think that's quite right because they're entirely avoidable. For me, the ugly stage starts with an outbreak of diatoms, that little brown dusting on your sand bed, and ends with an outbreak of algae, usually green hair algae. Those life forms are a totally natural part of photosynthetic life in a young tank, as they take advantage of the fact that there's lots of light and no natural competition. So there's not much you can do to avoid it, and you're best served by not having your lights up too high, not feeding too much, and just riding it out. Whereas things like cyanobacteria and dinoflagellates take advantage of conditions that shouldn't be present in the early stages of a tank and are totally avoidable. And I could have avoided the cyano on this tank if I'd kept on top of testing and made sure neither my nitrate nor phosphate dropped to 0. Now, you'll usually avoid that just through adding food to your tank, but if your nitrate and phosphate do zero out after an initial peak, the easiest way to combat that is just to very gently dose a little bit of liquid nitrate and phosphate, then test regularly and adjust accordingly. But because I didn't manage to avoid the cyano, I now need a plan to beat it. And for now, I just suck out as much of the stuff as I can during my fortnightly water changes. And I also use a small return pump to blow some of the cyano off the rockwork and down into the sump, where it gets removed by my filter roller. It is a bit ugly, but it's not doing any harm, so I'm not really in a rush to get rid of it, so I'll just see how this plan goes over the next month or two, and I'll reconsider my strategy if that doesn't work. And the other unsightly problem I have is an outbreak of vermetid snails. That's what these little crusty tubes are, and in my experience there's no easy way of getting rid of them. My plan is to snap off as many as I can to thin out their numbers, and I'll try getting some bumblebee snails as well, which are reported to eat vermetid snails, although I've never had any luck on that front in my own personal experience. But the vermetids don't really bother me, and I only tend to notice them when I look at my corals close up, so managing their population is probably probably going to be good enough for me. In terms of fish, I have the 2 clowns I carried over from the Fujifilm Evo, and I've added a Midas blenny and a small shrimp goby to go with my pistol shrimp. Now that's probably maximum stocking level for this tank, although with 1/3 of a cube of frozen food going in once per day, the fish seem happy and my nutrients are under control, so I definitely don't think it's overstocked. I'm not going heavy on filtration, and in fact I'm only running a Clarity SK3000 filter roller at the moment. That, along with regular water changes, seems to be doing the job for now, and I like that the tank runs completely silently without a skimmer, as well as the fact that the Clarity requires very little maintenance. At the rate it's going currently, I won't need to change my first roll for a good 6 months, so this should be a fairly hassle-free tank. Now, because I added several LPS corals from day one, I had to do something to replace the calcium and alkalinity they use up, so I started dosing more or less straight away. I first started off by dosing Calquasser, which replaces calcium and alkalinity and boosts your tank's pH, but I decided to switch to 2-part because I got fed up of mixing a new batch of Calquasser every 2 weeks. Now that's not an especially big maintenance burden, but given I have 3 tanks at the moment, I'm keen to reduce maintenance on this tank wherever possible. And on that point, while having 3 tanks might sound awesome, the reality is that they take up quite a lot of time, so I often end up neglecting at least one of them at various stages, and that is why I ended up with cyanobacteria on this tank. The 2-part dosing I've gone for is from a UK company called Reef Zlements, and I'm using the pH Plus version, which claims to significantly increase your tank's pH level. Word on the street is that it does so by using sodium hydroxide, which is an extra spicy version of calcium hydroxide, aka Calquasser. Although when I asked the manufacturer, unsurprisingly they didn't say what's in it, so that's just speculation for now. I'm currently dosing just 5 ml per day of 2-part, so these 2 720 ml containers will last over 4 months between refills, and unlike Calquasser, as well as adding calcium and alkalinity, Reef Zlements will also add magnesium and trace elements. Now I'm not measuring the pH on this tank, so I can't tell you how effective the Reef Zlements is at that, but I may do so at some point in the future. And from what I've heard from other Reef Zlements users, the pH Plus is so effective at increasing pH that most people dose half of the pH Plus mixed in with half of the standard non-pH Plus Reef Zlements 2-part. But all that really matters to me is that my corals are generally nice and healthy, so I'm not really interested in monitoring pH on this tank, especially given I want this tank to be simple. One thing I will say about Reef Zlements pH Plus is that you need to create a high flow area in your sump if you want to dose the stuff. I started by dosing it into a mini waterfall at the entrance of my return pump section, but it just settled out at the bottom of the sump and didn't mix in with the water. So I've now added an AI Nero 3 powerhead, which stirs it into the water instantly and has completely sorted the problem. In terms of lighting, I did start with a Radeon XR15 Pro, but I swapped it out after about a month. It's a really good light and it gave very impressive spread, but I just didn't get on with it. It puts out a lot less PAR than I expected, and I personally find the Mobius app it runs on to be a little clunky, but none of that really matters, and the main reason I swapped it was because I couldn't get the colour spectrum looking the way I like it. And as you'll know if you've watched the channel long enough, I have a bit of an obsession with shimmer, which means I like to run Kessils wherever possible, so I've gone for a Kessil A360X on this tank. Now on a 50cm cube like this, an A360X would be more than enough on its own, but I added 2 AI blade grows as well, partly to give full physical light coverage over the entire tank, but mainly for the fluorescent pop under blues in the evening that the Kessils are lacking. It's the same setup I run on my Waterbox LPS tank and is in my opinion pretty much lighting perfection. I did a PAR test when I installed these to make sure I wasn't giving my corals too much light, and I'm getting PAR of around 80 to 120 across most of the tank with a peak of around 150, which is pretty much perfect for soft and LPS corals, and I certainly don't want it to be any higher than that. I run the Kessil at a peak intensity of 35%, and I'll link a video at the top of the screen with my AI blade settings, which I've carried over from my Fujifilm Evo. And if you're wondering, I DIY'd the mounting setup with a black shelving bracket, a length of 20mm aluminium profile, and a couple of 3D printed parts to tidy it up. It's fair to say it's not the last word in sophistication, but it does the job and it's neat enough for my purposes. And the last thing I want to talk about is my Aquascape. I bought the scape with the Fujifilm Evo in mind, and it was the perfect height for that tank, which is much lower, but now it's in this tank, which is 50cm or just under 2 feet tall. It does look a bit low. Although to be fair, that's actually grown on me and I quite like the compact rockscape, but I do think it needs a little something up high, so I've set about fixing that. The original plan was to have a torch garden at the top of the tall rock on the right, as I figured the torch tentacles would stretch out high and give the illusion of a tall escape over time as the torches grew out. But I recently decided to move the torches away and add a bubble tip anemone in their place. So I bought a lovely tricolour nem and carefully placed it at the top of the rock exactly where I wanted it. But that lasted all of 10 minutes, and the very next day it had done what anemones do and scooched off to the other island underneath an overhang in the worst possible place for my viewing pleasure. Now I don't think there's much I can do about that, and it will ultimately settle where it's most happy. So I'm just going to leave it be and hope that it decides to move back somewhere with a little more light, but if it stays put, I'll have to rethink my plans for the top of the tall rock, and I'm currently thinking a nice goniopora coral would be the best choice. Probably a red one, because I've accidentally ended up with a lot of green corals in this tank. My original hope was that the 2 clownfish would live in the anemone, and that may still happen, but if it doesn't, there's a chance my anemone crab will do so instead, which would be almost as cool. So now you're up to speed with the Cade Nano tank at the 3-month mark. I'll keep you up to date with how it gets on, and it will be over my shoulder in all of my videos, so you'll have a rough idea of how it's getting on. But in the meantime, if you've got any questions, let me know in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed the video, give me a thumbs up and subscribe for next time, and until then, happy reefing.